Bakewell, in the heart of Derbyshire's Peak District, was the kind of town where scandal seemed impossible, a postcard village of stone cottages, winding streets, and a steady rhythm of life. But on September 12, 1973, something happened in Bakewell Cemetery that would shatter its quiet image forever. A respected young woman entered at lunchtime and within minutes was found beaten, assaulted, and left for dead. Her name was Wendy Sewell, and her death would launch one of Britain's longest and most bitterly contested murder sagas. Wendy was 32 years old, a legal secretary with a polished reputation. To the outside world, she seemed the picture of composure, hard-working, capable, and admired. But those who knew her privately described a more complicated life. Her marriage was strained, her personal choices sometimes raised eyebrows, and in a small town where gossip was currency, Wendy's independence made her both respected and whispered about. Later, those complexities, her rumored affairs, her reputation, would be weaponized against her memory, as if her life were a puzzle piece in the battle over what really happened that day. At just before 1 o'clock on September 12th, Wendy left her office for her lunch break. She walked toward Bakewell Cemetery, a familiar and ordinary path. A witness saw her enter through the gates. Minutes later, she was struck down. Her attacker wielded a pickaxe handle, a tool taken from the grounds, and delivered 7 brutal blows to her head. She was also sexually assaulted. Her trousers, underwear, and shoes were disturbed or removed. Despite the savagery, Wendy clung to life. When help arrived, she was still conscious, trying to rise before collapsing against a gravestone. 2 days later, she died in hospital. The investigation moved quickly, but not smoothly. 17-year-old Stephen Downing, the cemetery groundskeeper, had been nearby. He was the one who found Wendy, kneeling beside her body when others arrived. Blood stained his clothes and hands. He explained it came from trying to comfort her, but to police it looked damning. When officers asked why he wanted to wash his hands, Stephen said it was because they were covered in blood, yet that simple statement was taken as a sign of guilt. Stephen was taken in and questioned. Here lay one of the investigation's greatest controversies. He had learning difficulties, functioning at the level of a much younger boy, and struggled to read or write. He was questioned for 8 hours straight without a lawyer, without a caution, and subjected to tactics later described as coercive, officers keeping him awake, pulling his hair, shaking him. Tired and overwhelmed, Stephen eventually signed a confession. At the time, Wendy was still alive, so the charge was assault. When she died, it became murder. But the case was already compromised. The confession would prove to be the cornerstone of the prosecution, yet its reliability was deeply flawed. Stephen later recanted, saying he had only signed because he thought Wendy would live, and that admitting to an assault might allow him to go home. But the damage was done. At his trial, the prosecution leaned on 2 key points: the confession and forensic evidence. A forensic scientist testified that the blood patterns on Stephen's clothes were consistent with him being the attacker. But critics later noted that the science of bloodstain interpretation in the early 1970s was crude and open to misinterpretation. Downing's defense argued the blood had been transferred when Wendy, semi-conscious, shook her head, spraying him with droplets as he bent over her. To jurors, however, the picture painted was clear. Stephen made his own situation worse. During the trial, he admitted he had indecently assaulted Wendy as she lay injured. To the jury, it was damning. Within 1 hour of deliberation, they convicted him of murder. He was sentenced to indefinite detention with a minimum of 17 years. For years, the case seemed closed, but cracks remained. Witnesses later came forward with accounts that contradicted the prosecution's timeline. One woman said she saw Stephen leaving the cemetery while Wendy was still alive, though her sightlines and memory were later questioned. Others described seeing strangers around the grounds that day. There were also rumors about Wendy's personal life, that she may have been meeting someone in the cemetery, perhaps a lover. Those whispers, whether founded or not, gave rise to theories that her death was more complex than a chance attack. Then there were the mistakes. Evidence collection was sloppy by today's standards. The murder weapon, the pickaxe handle, was not preserved under proper conditions. It was later put on display in a museum, handled by countless people. When modern tests, years later, found an unidentified palm print on it, it meant nothing. Contamination had destroyed its value. No DNA evidence was preserved, robbing investigators of the chance to apply modern science to the case. For decades, Stephen Downing languished in prison, unable to secure parole because he refused to admit guilt. In the mid-1990s, his family turned to local journalist Don Hale, who became convinced of Stephen's innocence. Hale launched a campaign exposing the flaws in the confession and the lack of solid evidence. He cast doubt on the prosecution's forensics and suggested alternative suspects, including people in Wendy's orbit. His campaign painted Stephen as a victim of injustice, and Wendy, cruelly, as a woman whose lifestyle had somehow played into her death. She was labeled promiscuous, given the derogatory nickname the Bakewell Tart, her memory distorted in service of the campaign. Hale's efforts bore fruit. In 2001, Stephen was released on appeal. In 2002, his conviction was overturned, with the court ruling that his confession was unsafe and the trial unfair. He had served 27 years. The case was hailed as one of the longest miscarriages of justice in British legal history, but the reinvestigation that followed told a more complicated story. Derbyshire police launched Operation Noble, re-examining every lead at enormous cost. They interviewed over 1,600 people and investigated 22 alternative suspects, many named in Hale's campaign. Every one of them was eliminated. Only Stephen Downing remained. Police also reported that Stephen had, in private moments, confessed to Wendy's murder after his release, once to his father, once in an argument with a girlfriend that was secretly taped, and again in a recorded conversation. He refused to be re-interviewed, but the shadow of suspicion returned. Theories swirled. Some continued to believe Stephen was innocent, a vulnerable teenager railroaded by aggressive police tactics and unreliable science. Others believed he was guilty all along, freed only on technicalities. There were whispers of another assailant, perhaps a stranger passing through Bakewell, or even a link to serial killers like Peter Sutcliffe, though those claims were dismissed by police. Some pointed to Wendy's personal life, suggesting she was meeting someone in the cemetery that day, but no evidence has ever substantiated that. Wendy's family endured not just her death, but decades of speculation that twisted her legacy. She was not perfect. She had her flaws, her downfalls, and a marriage under strain, but she did not deserve what happened to her, nor the cruel way her memory was dragged through campaigns and books. The murder of Wendy Sewell remains officially unsolved. Stephen Downing walks free, his conviction overturned but never erased from suspicion. Police continue to maintain that he is the only suspect who cannot be eliminated. Nearly 50 years later, the case stands as a lesson in the dangers of rushed confessions, flawed investigations, and the heavy price of doubt. It remains one of Britain's most haunting murder mysteries, a story where truth and justice have remained stubbornly out of reach, leaving behind only questions. Who killed Wendy Sewell that September afternoon in Bakewell Cemetery? Was it truly the teenager convicted in 1974, or was there another figure who slipped away, shielded by mistakes, lost evidence, and time? Unless new evidence comes to light, the answers may remain buried with the secrets of that quiet Derbyshire town.
In the end, every shadow leaves its echo, and every tale lingers long after the last words fade. Thank you for walking this dark path with me. Until next time, be kind.